Hello and welcome back to Radio Rothbard. We're doing a special extra episode this week in response to the mob break-in at the U.S. Capitol, which occurred yesterday. And for this time around, we've got myself, of course. I'm Ryan McMaken. I'm a senior editor at the Mises Institute. And also joining me is Jeff Deist, the president of the Mises Institute. And of course, also Tho Bishop, our associate editor. And we decided to get together for a little while and talk about what's going on at the Capitol. What does it mean, really, if anything much? Or maybe it means a lot. And we'll just kind of go through it, maybe look at the media coverage a little bit, look at some of the terms being thrown around like coup, and to see if this is remotely accurate, and maybe look at how this event might be used against Trump supporters or people like them in the future, and really just where all this might lead. So, Jeff and Tho, good to talk to you.
Thanks, Ryan.
Quite an interesting week.
And so just for people who are listening, let's just give them a kind of a general overview of how we view this. I mean, my own view is that this is genuinely a mob. I think that's an accurate term. And they showed up at the Capitol, and I found it a little bit surprising that they were able to get past the guards so easily and start wandering through the building, taking photos of themselves with statues. And the double standard immediately became clear, right? This was a horribly violent event in the media, whereas much of what went on over the summer in terms of buildings being burned down and so on, these were all fiery but mostly peaceful protests. And what's your reading on it?
You know, someone who used to work at the Capitol, the fact that it was so easy to get through, I think really was interesting. I mean, I think it highlights the paper tiger of American defense in many ways. I mean, this is a city that has some of the most police officers per square foot of any place in the world, and yet there's only so much you can do when you're dealing with numbers of that size. None of it should be particularly surprising, though. I mean, I've been writing since the election, kind of highlighting the fact that you have a lot of people in the media and politics, et cetera, that are just trying to dismiss. They think that, if we certify a vote, then, these are the rules of the game. Why aren't you following it? Why aren't you following the leader? And it's obviously this is not going to work in a society where people are so polarized. They're getting their news from different sources. And when you have tens of millions of people that believe that we are going to inaugurate an illegitimate government, when people no longer view politics as a means of expressing their discontent, you're going to have non-political action. And that's exactly what we saw yesterday. The response to it is, again, rather than understanding where this frustration and anger is coming from, you've actually seen Republicans kind of distance themselves off from some of those concerns. I mean, again, Ted Cruz's idea of trying to have a commission to try to study the election and looking for election integrity was a way of trying to offer a handout to these people and their frustrations. Yes, in many ways, I'm glad they didn't do it, because I do not want to try to restore trust in the system we have. But the fact that was seen as an extremist proposal, the attacks that Ted Cruz faced, who I'm not a particularly big fan of, but like the attacks that he faced from just trying to say we need to find a way of dealing with this respectfully, that was obviously going to not end well, and that's what we saw yesterday.
Ryan, it's interesting. A couple years ago, I was thinking about 9/11, and some of us were in the Capitol that morning. And so I guess there's a little bit of a similarity here. But I went and did some research. And of course, Washington, D.C. has its own police force. But the Capitol complex, and by that I mean the Capitol Dome itself, the House and Senate side of the Capitol, then the House and Senate office buildings, and then across the street, the Supreme Court and Library of Congress have their own police, by the way. But Capitol Hill police have jurisdiction over about 25,000 people on any given day. That's House and Senate staffers, visitors to the area, that sort of thing. And yet they have a police force of 2,000 officers. As a matter of fact, their budget is larger than that of Atlanta Police Department. For, imagine what a police force would be normally for a town of 25,000 people. It'd probably be 10 officers or something like that. So they really do have lots and lots and lots of Capitol Hill police. And after 9/11, they sort of secured the streets around it with these big pop-up roadblock things, these metal things. So you actually have to have a staff badge to get past the roadblocks to presumably prevent a big vehicle or some sort of truck full of bombs or something from getting close. And, when you think of all this and when you see some of the footage yesterday of the police officers allowing the Trump forces to sort of walk by, it's a little laughable, I guess. Why do we have all these officers? It seems absurd.
Yeah, well, it's good. It's good to get some of those details because I haven't been in D.C. in decades, and so I've never actually witnessed this firsthand. But of course, after 9/11, I kept up with these new security measures, and I just figured the whole city was a fortress now. And so I was just shocked that this happened. You know what I think of sometimes when things like this happen is, I believe it was in the late 80s, there was a scandal where some female Soviet spies were able to get access to a U.S. embassy by basically like showing some cleavage to some embassy personnel who I believe were Marines, who then were carrying on with these women inside the embassy. And then these women, it turned out, were spies and were seizing information and so on. So apparently the chinks in this armor are quite a bit more accessible than one might think.
Well, it's true. But here's the thing, watching it yesterday, and this is going to be all about perceptions and the way the media couches, and I think it'll end up being sort of the end of Trump and Trumpism in certain ways, again, because of the way the media will write this and the way they'll characterize it versus, let's say, BLM and Antifa riots and violence and looting earlier this year. But what struck me is, the three of us are pretty jaundiced when it comes to the U.S. political system. And as a matter of fact, I would assume all three of us actually support the peaceable breakup of the United States. But even so, when I was watching that yesterday, some part of me found it a little bit unsettling to watch. So if I find it unsettling, imagine the perception of normies out there.
Well, I think it's interesting if you see some of the immediate polling, which is obviously, you don't want to treat polls as perfect. We definitely saw that last election cycle. The immediate response is that more Republicans actually support the actions than oppose it. More of them blame Biden than Trump. You have, I think it's natural to have, copium, right? They're trying to create your own justifications for this. That's where you get people trying to blame, this is Antifa. This was not our people. These are provocateurs. There might be some people mixed in there, but people are creating their own narratives to justify it. And I think that's something where I'm a little bit more encouraged than I was perhaps yesterday, because if you can't separate this, I don't think, entirely from the rally earlier in the day where Trump was going to war against the GOP by name, the actions of Pence with vote certification, the actions of some of the senators backing away from plans on opposing the certification of the election. And then, of course, with the Georgia elections, where, again, that was already, you saw the breakdown of the McConnell-Trump GOP era. And so if the next 2 years of American politics really comes down to the battle for the GOP and whether Trumpism can stand here, I think that Trumpism actually has a chance of maintaining. I know, talking to, again, relatively normal, non-Rothbardian Republicans in the Florida Panhandle, their response today is not, well, I'm not sure how I feel about this Trump thing anymore. The last thing I want to do is retreat to what has failed in the past. It's time to strengthen now. They want to continue. And if that continues, if the media cannot, when our consumption of information now is so polarized, the impact of the gatekeepers of the press on trying to impact a large percentage of the country is far more difficult than it has been in the past. Now, again, independents and Democrats, that independent voter is the real question mark going forward. But I think the Republicans stand here. I don't think Trumpism is necessarily dead within the GOP as it is.
Yes, I'm acutely aware most of the time that my personal views have very little in common with those of the average Americans. And along those lines, my initial reaction to this was no particular concern over the Senate or House as an institution. I don't revere these places or the institutions themselves. They're mostly filled with people who are criminals and thieves and people who do very bad things, both to Americans and especially to foreigners a lot of the time, although in the minority, there are some decent people. However, I could see that, and I could see how the media would look at that and portray it in a certain way. And that's what began to concern me almost immediately. And also, I kind of wonder what was the end game here? What were they hoping to accomplish? Because, of course, Tom Massey, one of the few good guys in the House, he noted yesterday that, look, there's not going to be a overturn of the results. The Republicans or Trump supporters don't have the votes to do it. And so you could storm the Capitol all day long, and it wasn't going to change the outcome of the Electoral College. And so it just seems to me that it's almost like giving a gift to the people who hate these Trump people. However, maybe there might be another outcome. Maybe some people might be happy to see that the other side also is willing to engage in rather extensive forms of protest and rioting, just as the left was doing all summer, because this does send a message that you really can't just do whatever you want and nobody's ever going to push back through some sort of non-electoral means. So it could be that that would give heart to some people who have felt despair about the regime being able to do whatever it wants and trample people's rights all day long. I don't know.
You know, Ryan, I was struck by the different perception here when private property, as you mentioned over the summer, was being, in some cases, looted and burned, not just, protests spilled over into property violence. Whereas here, it appears that there was a little bit of tossing around of papers and theft and all that. But for the most part, the Capitol wasn't burned down. It wasn't destroyed in any way. But yet, people like Dick Durbin, the loathsome senator from Illinois, I saw him last night saying, well, the Senate chamber is sacred. And what happened, was profane. And so he's using this religious language to discuss the Capitol. And nobody would use that kind of language to discuss a Lululemon store in L.A. somewhere where some people broke in and got some free, $95 yoga pants.
Or even when you had a historic church being burnt in D.C. just a few months ago, and the way that the press treated breaking windows in the Capitol relative to burning down, the attempt to burn down a historically significant church. I think it's quite telling. The religiosity of politics was on full display yesterday for sure.
Yes, as an actual religious person, I always find this so totally absurd. Any references to the desecration of a political building or the Senate floor being sacred and so on. I mean, this should be regarded as laughable nonsense, but the predictable backlash, or I guess just response, really, from politicians, both Republican and Democrat, was about what you might expect. Just absolutely appalled that anyone would get in their faces.
Right. And what's so funny here is that in terms of your day-to-day life, your local power company's substation is more important to you than the U.S. Capitol. The guy driving the truck to Kroger, that truck is more meaningful to you than the entire U.S. Capitol in a sense. I mean, you want to buy some burgers for dinner tonight.
Well, what did we learn from the media reaction to this? We've touched a little bit on how they reacted very differently to this than to the summer riots. How are they going to try and spin all of this?
The blowback here is one of the things that I'm really concerned about, particularly when you're able to combine the media narrative with the power of a Biden administration on top of what we're already seeing now with big tech. Trump is now banned, I think, on all social media platforms through the inauguration. He will not be long on Twitter as one of our predictions for the new year. I think it's going to check out very, very quickly. But it was fascinating. And I mean, I enjoyed it because I got a sick sense of humor watching CNN's coverage of it. I mean, there's something particularly outlandish with Van Jones acting appalled at these revolutionaries when, the man himself was at one point a card-carrying communist in the United States. He was absolutely outraged at how could people dare question the legitimacy of their government. Jack Tapper at some point made this remarkable statement about how America now has two parties, a patriot party and a traitor party. And now it's time for people like Kevin McCarthy to take a stand. And one of the things I think is interesting is the Republican response to it. You get people like Thomas Massie and Rand Paul, who ideologically, obviously we're quite aligned with. But I think there's a huge missed opportunity here in the way that, obviously you can condone violence, condone damage, all those things should go without saying. But I think the inability of truly trying to empathize and understand the anger that these people come from. Someone like Rand Paul in particular, he should understand this frustration and anger with the American empire as it stands right now. And I think we're not doing ourselves any favor by simply saying that these people are true deplorables. I think that them lacking any sort of sympathetic voice, Matt Gaetz, his talk may have come the closest to it. I don't think that is good for anyone going forward as well. And I'm interested to see if and how that ends up presenting itself in whether the media, politics, Trump, who knows, who becomes a voice of these people going forward, I think is going to be an interesting thing to monitor.
Well, though the obvious thing to mention here is that in the eyes of the media, and certainly in the eyes of most people on the left, BLM and Antifa riots are noble and virtuous and justified and motivated by noble ends. And so any violence or destruction which does occur can be excused. Whereas white Trumpers never, ever have a legitimate political beef. And so anything they do is motivated by, some loss of their country or white supremacy or whatever it is. So that's clearly at work here.
Well, and if we just scan the headlines on this, we can see attempts to blow this up into a major event. Let's see what we got. The New Republic headline, this is a very American coup. The Atlantic, this is worse than treason. In another article, scenes from an American coup. This is a coup, even in Foreign Policy magazine, which should definitely know better. And in November of 2019, interestingly, there was an article that came out in an academic journal called Coup with Adjectives. And it talked about this issue of stretching or innovating the concept of the coup. Ironically, as the number of real coups decline, we're now coming up with different kinds of coups with an adjective attached. One term being like self-coup or a political coup or a soft coup or even a democratic coup, whatever that means. And the notion being that, well, okay, everybody really historically knows what a coup is. It's when somebody shows up with a renegade army detachment and they have a couple of tanks and they've got machine guns and they surround the Capitol building and they kidnap or maybe imprison the entire legislature, or they just kill and replace the president and that sort of thing. And so now what we got are a coup being carried out by a bunch of mostly unarmed people carrying Trump flags, and they had a couple of pipe bombs somewhere. And this now is what constitutes a coup. So, of course, it just totally cheapens the word. But the point is to portray it as this grossly violent and illegitimate and Latin American type of anti-democratic takeover, which, as far as I could tell, really isn't warranted in this situation at all.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that during the Kavanaugh hearings, you had protesters. I mean, there are alarms going off. I think they're going into unauthorized areas, occupying one of the Senate buildings, trying to stall that vote. You had obviously the protests and occupation of the Wisconsin state capitol during the Scott Walker years over the, how dare they try to rein in, I think it was a teacher pension issue or maybe it was a school choice issue, something education related. You don't want to anger those teacher unions. I'm not surprised, obviously, that there's a double standard held by the media. But again, if you even want very specific examples of occupational politics, again, there's been plenty of examples on the left that have long been forgotten by your average person in a way that this will obviously not be. But again, the beauty of it is the fact that the media has been so arrogant, so heavy-handed with their bias that, again, the more people that tune into Newsmax and tune into all these alternative stations and they're watching YouTube channels rather than cable news, the ability to create that manufactured consent on this issue is going to be more difficult now than ever before. And that just, I think, highlights the way that, it's not just Trump. There's so many aspects to the modern American political environment that are lending itself in ways that are going to be chaotic and at some points very scary, but in many ways, I think offer more optimism for dealing with the real systemic issues that exist in our power structure than ever before. I've been a particularly optimistic guy since the election about where the political movement is. I have concerns about what yesterday will do, but I have not lost my optimism in the long run. I think that there are ways, there are opportunities that exist for people that want to take advantage of them to get us closer to where we need for something that actually resembles a peaceful political process.
Well, let's look at it a little bit more in the long run. How will this affect 2022? My prediction has always been, and I don't see this impacting it much, is that the Dems are holding on to this razor-thin margin in the Congress, and if the usual happens, they'll lose a bunch of seats. I think an average, these midterm elections, an average of 30-something seats is lost, and it could be even more. I'm thinking back to 1994 when Clinton had right up to then, from 92 to 94, had a total control of the federal government at that time, although there were a lot more blue dog Democrats back then. Nevertheless, pretty big turnover. And I think they know it. And that was a big concern that occurred after the election this last time, was because they could see they had a real tenuous grip, especially on a lot of Hispanic minority groups and so on out west in a lot of those districts. So I don't know. Will this affect that in 22 and then 24? Is this even big enough a thing that we're going to be talking about it 5 years from now?
Well, they're going to try to make it a big enough thing that we're going to be talking about it 5 years from now. Absolutely. I've seen a lot of comparisons to 9/11 amongst the Twitterati. But as you mentioned, Foreign Policy Magazine or somebody, a Democratic coup is when the wrong guy wins. And so Trump won. And now, of course, Biden has to win. Because he's the right guy, at least for the moment. So it strikes me that Biden's going to be under a lot of pressure to enact vengeance on the red states and on the Trumpers. So the people who got Biden into office, who are actually like Kamala Harris a lot more, are going to be saying, right away, it's got to be vaccines for everybody so we get past COVID. Right away, it's got to be lots and lots of minority and female folks, occupying all the cabinet positions and all the departments and agencies. Right away, it's got to be probably some sort of, there's going to be pressure. I don't know if Biden will succumb to it, but there's got to be a lot of pressure for him to prosecute Trump and some people around Trump. There's going to be a lot of pressure to immediately begin dealing with things like reparations, to immediately be enshrining some of the demands of Antifa and Black Lives Matter into federal policy. So he's not going to have some honeymoon from his left flank. But there is a lot of Trump fatigue out there, and do they want to overplay their hand with respect to 2022? I mean, we have to remember that regardless of the psychological impact of yesterday, and that's a lot stronger on people like us who spend time on social media. A lot of people, it's sort of just a news story, and they don't really obsess over it. But we have very gerrymandered districts throughout this country, so most members of Congress and most senators have to worry about a primary more than they have to worry about a general election. So that's where the action is. Everything interesting happens on the margins. So if Trumpism survives and takes a different form, then the down the middle milquetoast people are, Republicans in Congress are going to have to worry about their Trump flank. And if wokeism and BLM and Antifa become the animating force on the left, and there are demands made of Biden, then all these Democrats in the House and Senate are going to have to worry about their sort of AOC left flank.
And I think that one of the things that work to the advantage of Republicans is that, the Democrats in D.C. are just as incompetent as Republican leadership is. You already saw the A woman, ending of the prayer, just taking on a really stupid culture war issue with no upside. And so I feel comfortable betting that the arrogance of power on the Democrats are going to have them overreaching in ways that are going to offend all sorts of voters that are offended today, 2 years from now. And of course, going to the point about gerrymandering, one of the big defeats for Democrats this last election cycle is their inability to take over some of the state legislators that they were looking at, particularly Texas, Iowa, some of these other states. So Republicans are going to have an upper hand on drawing those districts. Which I think will matter. But I really do think that the next 2 years, more than anything else, is going to be how much can the Democrats shoot themselves in the foot by chasing these cultural issues. I think Democratic leadership likes those because they are ways of trying to distract from unpopular economic issues that their left flank really wants. I think they're going to try to find a way to give a token, representation of black figures and things like that in American history rather than actual reparations, because they know the polling data on that and a lot of those districts that they need to actually maintain power. So I think you're going to have a lot more of the symbolic cultural left issues rise rather than actual policy. And meanwhile, the really interesting battle is going to be, again, whether who wins the civil war that is on the right. I mean, now you have like people like Newt Gingrich out there saying that anybody affiliated with an extremist group should be barred from the Republican Party, and calling on the Democratic Party to do the same. So, okay, that sounds fine in theory, but when you've had 2 years of the media making people with social media accounts, cue stuff and things like that as these extremist groups, you're now starting to talk about people that have views that skepticism about the morality of government officials. That's something where if Republican RNC types really start to get hard on, I think that the grassroots base of the party could rise up in a way that we've already seen this happen before. We saw with the Tea Party, where a lot of the machines of the Republican Party itself, people like A.J. Spiker was a Ron Paul guy that took over became chairman of the Iowa State Party, things like that. We've seen grassroots conservative American right, coalition people take over these periods in recent politics, recent history before. And I think that, again, the disconnect between the very serious conservative pundits in isolated cities relative to what I experienced in the Florida Panhandle is going to show itself in ways that could make for some very interesting primaries in that 2022 cycle.
Well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up with that. It seems that the staying power of this event will depend a little bit on what comes afterward. Well, is this the first of many similar events that will take place soon? Or will it fizzle out, in which case we'll kind of forget about it? Or will there be elections in the near future that result in an overwhelming victory for one side or the other as a reaction to this event? That's unclear still. But we may know in a few years, and in 10 years, and maybe even further out, if something much larger and much bigger, and maybe hopefully not, something much more violent takes place. But we'll be back next week with another episode of Radio Rothbard. And until then, have a wonderful week.